All right. Good noon, everybody. Well, we are a little bit late from the intended start time. 24 hours and 9 minutes to be exact. We had a couple of inevitable delays, but if you are joining me now, very much appreciate it. I know it's been a bit since we've gotten to do one of these Bible studies. Of course, if you've been keeping up with me, you know that we've had a few things delaying us, one of them being the trip I recently made to Kenya. If you want to see more about that, that's in a previous video. Wherever you're watching this, you can probably find it fairly easily. But now it's time for us to get into a brand new Bible study, and it's one I've been looking forward to for quite some time. It's one of my absolute favorite subjects. We're going to be studying the life of Christ. The title of the study is God Was Here, and this is putting a little bit of emphasis on Christ's divinity. Now, that being said, uh, that might be a better study specifically for the book of John. And that's the one account of Christ that we're not going to be getting into in this study, but there will be more on that later as we introduce the topic. Now, Jesus is, in my opinion, the single most misrepresented character in all of history. I can think of nobody who this is the record that we have of them, and that record has been twisted so far by so many people in order to fit their own agenda. I guarantee you that at some point you have heard an outright lie about who Jesus was, something that somebody just made up. You know, a couple years ago, I picked up this magazine that I saw at the grocery store. It's Life magazine. Jesus, who do you say that I am? And I kind of got this because I correctly suspected there would be a lot of inaccurate information on it. Now, some of the information they have about this is inaccurate, and I kind of think they know that, but they're throwing it out there just because they know that's the way that gets attention. I'm not accusing them of any sort of, let me adjust this real quick. I'm not accusing them of any sort of dishonesty. But well, look for example at the cover really closely. You might see a problem right off the bat, and honestly, that's one of the most common lies about Jesus, which is his skin color. This sort of goes into a great problem when it gets into studying Jesus because people want to put on their own politics onto Christ, which is a serious problem. And one of the ways that shows up is people will lie or twist the scriptures about the race of Jesus. Well, before we go any further, I can tell you right now um, that Jesus was Jewish, period. He was not white, he was not black, he was not Palestinian, as a lot of people might be saying right now. The he would look a lot like a modern day Palestinian, but he was absolutely a Jew. Uh, Probably the closest equivalent we have now is an ethnic group known as Sephardic Jews. And people have tried to twist that forever, right? Uh, Take a guy, for example, like Adolf Hitler. Hitler very much wanted Jesus to be white. Hitler was nominally a Christian. I must emphasize the word nominally there, but he would claim to follow Christ. And one of the things that you have a problem with then is, you know, a mass extermination of Jews. Um, how exactly are we going to justify this if Jesus himself was a Jew? Which is why Hitler said Jesus was most certainly not a Jew, and he came up with this convoluted idea that the people of the city of Galatia, because that's very close to the word Gaul, were actually from France, which is what Gaul or France was called Gaul in those days, and that Galatia is still way north of where Jesus grew up, and maybe some people came down from there, and that's actually who Jesus was. And so, conveniently, Jesus is not Jewish, but he's actually a white guy. And that, well, it's absurd. And of course, you hear the same thing the other way. Jesus was not black. Yes, I know. Revelation 1 says that his hair was like wool. That's being completely taken out of context, and I don't believe it's being done in good faith because when you read it, the quality of it being like wool is made clear because it says it is white like wool. Furthermore, when you read it in its context, it's very clear this is not Jesus looking as he normally does, because when you read it in the context, it's John seeing a vision or a dream of Christ. And there's a lot of things that I'm pretty sure Jesus didn't normally look like in that context. It says that his eyes are burning and that there's a sword coming out of his mouth. Pretty sure this is not what Jesus looks like regularly, but this is an extreme vision of Jesus that John is receiving. And of course, the idea that he was Palestinian, which people will push as well, once again for political purposes. And I should mention, by the way, I'm not pushing a political agenda right now, but I do have a problem with people using Jesus, especially falsely, in order to further their political agendas. The fact is, there was no such thing as a Palestinian during the time of Christ, and ethnically, the Palestinians are Arabic. Now, there were Arabs at the time, but Jesus wasn't one of them. We need to be accurate about who Jesus was. Jesus was a Jew. Once again, if you want to know what he looked like, look up what Sephardic Jews look like today. That's what he looked like. But honestly, if you understand the story of Jesus, you understand it doesn't really matter what he looked like. And so anybody who puts a lot of emphasis on his appearance is really missing the point. Isaiah told us that he has no form or comeliness that we might desire him. We don't actually get a physical description of Jesus anywhere in the Bible, except in places such as Revelation 1, where it's very clearly not giving us the typical description of Jesus. But we don't really know what he looked like, but we can say, based upon Isaiah, he would have looked just about like anybody in that area at the time. He wasn't a super handsome dude. Oftentimes he's portrayed as this extremely good-looking person, but he really wouldn't have been. He would have been average in his appearance. There was nothing about him that made him special. In fact, if anything, it would have been less than special, which is part of the reason he's born in the manger, right? It's in contrast to being born in some palace with all of the accolades. No, no, no. He is born humbly. His appearance would have been humble, and he wouldn't have really looked all that different than anybody else. The power from Jesus came not from his appearance, but instead from the things that he did. There are other things that are often said about Jesus, once again, to further political agendas. One person might say Jesus was a communist. Another person might say that Jesus was a nationalist and intensely proud of his country. Both of those people are wrong. Jesus was, in fact, intensely apolitical. He absolutely, and this is one of these things that really astounds me what people will claim about Jesus, because if you read anything about it, you would know Jesus really, really is apathetic towards the affairs of governments on earth. He tells us that we ought to obey them, right? Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So if you're being if you're being taxed, pay your taxes. But to God, the things that are God's, right? That's his way of saying, don't focus on these things of government and governing. We're not focused on the kingdoms of the earth, you Christians. You're supposed to be focused on the things of God. Do what you have to, and then focus on God. And so, no, Jesus was not a particularly political person either. And then you also get some other increasingly absurd claims of Jesus, often claims of sexual immorality about Jesus. Some people said he had an affair with Mary Magdalene. Some people claim he was a homosexual. Elton John famously claimed that Jesus was a gay man. These claims are based upon absolutely nothing. Our records of Jesus are found entirely within the Bible, and then you have a couple of secular records about Jesus, namely from Josephus and Titus around that time. And of course, there's nothing of the sort to indicate that. This is a very clear case in both times of somebody just trying to change Christ to their own image. And really, that's kind of what's going on with all these other ways that we're trying to change Jesus into making him to be what we want him to be. There's a reason for that. And the reason is, I think a lot of people recognize that Jesus Christ is the most important character in history. Even if you're not a Christian, you have to recognize the extreme influence that Jesus has. A lot of people out there, I don't think they're really basing this on any legitimate evidence, but a lot of people think there wasn't even a Jesus at all. Even so, if that were true, it's not, but if it were true, still quite possibly the most influential character in all of history today. Two-thirds of people on this earth call themselves Christians. Now, if you actually read what Jesus said, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but those who do the will of my Father. Meaning, just because you call yourself a Christian doesn't actually make you one, right? You know, I can't call myself a Kenyan and instantly become a Kenyan. There's a process in order to become a Kenyan. You have to be naturalized. Same thing if someone's not an American and they want to become an American. So it's more than just what you are saying, right? So not everybody who says they're a Christian is truly a Christian, and I think we understand that, right? Once again, Adolf Hitler called himself a Christian. Well, I can, I, I am not the judge, but I can pretty well guarantee you, it's hot where Hitler's currently at, right? Um, so when we look at somebody like Jesus, we can see why people might want to recreate him in their own image because they see his extreme influence on the earth. Ever since he was born, I mean, you can go over to the 300s AD, and ever since then, Christianity has been a major part of history. Right around the 300s, that's when the Romans adopt Christianity as the state religion. Now, they don't really practice it properly, but even so, Jesus' influence is there. You get into the Middle Ages, Jesus' influence is there. All the way through history, Jesus' influence can be found in every single page after a certain point. People know that people love Jesus, and so people want to recreate him in their own image. But here's what makes Jesus truly special, because there's a lot of people who have had influence on history ever since their time, right? You can make a very strong case that a guy like Julius Caesar has a similar level of influence to Christ, right? Julius Caesar, you might say, is responsible for the great success of the Roman Empire. Now, I know I'm way oversimplifying things, but bear with me for a moment. And there are still vestiges of the Roman Empire affecting the world even today. You could easily say that a guy like Julius Caesar has a similar effect. And somebody might successfully argue that there have been people in history that have had more influence than Jesus Christ. I don't think so, but someone could argue it. But here's the part that you absolutely can't argue. Jesus is not just the main point of history from his time onward. Jesus is the center of all history. People in a secular context can influence the history after their time, but there's only ever been one man who has had a level of influence like Jesus even before his time, and that's because of the prophecies around him. Now, there were a couple of other people with prophecies around them. Cyrus the Great of the Medo-Persian Empire. He had prophecies around him, and so he has some influence even before he is born, but not like Jesus. Of course, there's only one place where you can see legitimate prophecy, that being within the Bible. And the number one topic of the Old Testament prophecies is Jesus Christ. There are over 300 messianic prophecies in the Old Testament telling us about Jesus, and that also has an influence on the world around them. Even at the very beginning, I believe firmly that when you read in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, when God is giving out punishments to Adam, Eve, and the serpent, he gets to the serpent, and he says, of course, the famous saying, on your belly you shall go, and you'll eat dust. But then he also says this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between her seed and your seed. And you shall bruise his heel, but he shall crush your head. Now, this is strange. It's really hard to figure out what he's talking about if you don't have more context going on. But then in the very next chapter, when Eve gives birth to Cain, she gives this curious phrase when she says, I have gotten a man from God. It seems to be that she thinks that this boy is the prophesied man who is going to crush the head of the devil. Of course, as we know, Cain absolutely wasn't. He was not going to crush the devil. He was going to succumb to the devil. And then you keep going further along and further along through history. You get to Abraham. He gets this interesting little bit. He has a very famous promise in Genesis chapter 12. Go to the land which I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, says God to Abraham. But then, at the end of that, he says this, and from you all nations of the earth shall be blessed. Doesn't really make sense if he's just talking about the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel, while it was God's chosen people because of their own disobedience, we saw this all over in Judges. They weren't even really a blessing to themselves. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't going to be something that would come from this nation that would be a blessing. That's just in the book of Genesis. You keep going through these books, and the frequency and specificity of the promises of who Christ is, it keeps happening and happening and getting stronger and stronger. And the Jews keep putting more and more hope in this promise of a Messiah. Do you think it made a difference in their everyday life? Because I certainly do. Jesus is the center of all history. And because of this, because of his extreme influence, people want to change him. If you want to actually know who Jesus was, then we must go to the only detailed record we have of him, which is the Bible. I mentioned that, I think I said Titus, that's incorrect. It should be Tacitus and Josephus. They both made records of who Jesus was, but it's passing notes, and they don't really understand, right? Because they're not focused about Jesus. It's other things. They might make mention of this sect of the Nazarenes or something like that, following this man named Jesus. But that's all it says. There's only one detailed record of Jesus, and if somebody claims to know something about Jesus that contradicts this record, they're just making it up, and we can't be doing that. You have to be vigilant for that sort of thing. Jesus said that, well, look over what Jesus says. This is one I went to a lot while I was over at Kenya. But it says in verse 15 of Matthew chapter 7, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves, who you will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from a thorn bush, or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Jesus warns us about false prophets, and you can tell if they're a false prophet based upon what? They're bearing good fruit. How do you know they're bearing good fruit? Well, you skip down a few verses to verse 24. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. That's a fairly famous, I don't know if you can really call it a metaphor, or rather a parable of Jesus. Maybe a metaphor. But right, you might have learned in VBS, the wise man built his house upon the rock. Well, what does it actually mean to build the house upon the rock? Jesus says it's you hear the words of Jesus and then you do them. Do you know that it's almost certain that when you were taught about Jesus, you were taught lies about him? It's a very good chance that you were not told the truth about Jesus. We've already gone over and just kind of scratched the surface of some of the common lies that are told about who Jesus was. But if somebody makes a claim about Jesus and it can't be supported by the Bible, they're not hearing the words of Jesus and then doing them. They're one of these ravenous wolves that Jesus talked about. Because people would love, and I mean love, to have Jesus on their side. But there's an easy way to have Jesus on your side. It's not by forcing him to be over on your side and changing what he said to fit what you want, but changing yourself to be what he wants. And there's absolutely no way you can do that if you don't actually know what he said. Now again, you might be of the bent that the Bible's completely inaccurate and we have, it's not actually saying what Jesus said. That's not true, but that's a totally different debate. Let's pretend that is for a second. Well, if that is true, then you have absolutely no way of knowing who Jesus was, because this is our only source. Now, once again, I think the Bible is accurate, and it plays out because it has certain qualities that make it pretty clear. It's more than just a man-made book. But if you really want to know who Jesus was, if you want to be a Christian, and a Christian means a follower of Christ, you cannot do it unless you know exactly who Jesus was. I am telling you, there are so many lies about this man. And if you're not able to distinguish the truth from the lies, you cannot be a follower. Now, here's the good news. It's pretty easy to distinguish the truth from the lies. All you have to do is compare it to what the Bible says. Jesus was a man of great contradiction. And I'm using that word uh, a little bit lightly, because really it's seeming contradictions. For example, he was a man who taught so much about love and mercy towards one another. And so far that people will often teach that he taught nothing of law at all. But that would be a contradiction. That would be a real contradiction. Remember what we saw in Matthew chapter 7? He who hears these words of mine and does them. That sounds like a law to me. Jesus was a lawgiver. But he also did teach love. People who are lazy with the scriptures will often only take one because they don't want to have to wrestle with finding the balance between the two of them. And so they will only look at the law of Christ and then completely forget some of the weightier matters, as Jesus would say, such as mercy and love. Others only want to look at the mercy and love and act as if there was nothing commanding in the Bible whatsoever. I'm sorry, the Bible says nothing of that sort. Again, he is a man known for his personal mercy and gentleness and tenderness and love. And I think that's probably pretty appropriate. But isn't it funny that when you actually look at Jesus' moments of gentleness, tenderness, and mercy, they don't actually outweigh some of his moments of wrath. Some people say the God of the Old Testament is a God of wrath, and that the God of the New Testament is a God of love and mercy. Well, then you got a whole lot of wrath in the New Testament you're going to have to explain. There are some of the more famous examples people like to bring up, like Jesus overturning the table of the money changers, which is true. But then there are parts people don't like to talk about, like the fact that nobody in the Bible, and I mean nobody, speaks about hell more than Jesus does. Did you know that? Did you know that Jesus is a hellfire and brimstone preacher? But like I said, I don't think it's inappropriate for us to think of his gentleness and his humility, because he exemplifies perfectly everything that he does. Once again, some people just want to focus on the love and the mercy and act like there's no such thing as the wrath and the anger. But it is there. You can't just ignore it because it inconveniences your philosophy. You must change your philosophy in order to fit the truth. That's what we all have to do all the time. But if you're lazy with it, you're only going to look at the wrath and the anger, which is not so common today, but man, in generations past, people did that. And then you might just look at the love and the mercy. But the truth is, there is no contradiction between the two of them. You just have to be patient with it, and you have to say to yourself, I really want to understand this. And of course, there's the great contradiction of Christ, that this is one who is God and simultaneously is man. There are things about God and man that are incompatible. Man is by his nature imperfect. God is by his nature perfect. Man does not have perfect justice. God does. Man does not have perfect mercy and love, but God does. And so having one who is walking among us, and he looks exactly like everybody else, and he goes through the exact same things we do. The Bible tells us he was tempted at all points, such as we are. And not even as a particularly wealthy one. He wasn't the absolutely poorest man in town, but he was a poor man. I can pretty well guarantee you that. There's been a recent surge of people making claims that Jesus and the apostles were actually decently wealthy men. That couldn't be further from the truth. But at the same time, this is God, who just looks like anybody else. God himself, creator of the universe, the one to whom all glory is owed. When he comes to earth, he does not come in some huge display of glory for absolutely everybody to see, not born in some great palace crowned in lightning and angels. And he doesn't come demanding uh, demanding compensation for this all the sins against him. But instead, he comes in the form of a helpless baby, born to a poor family, with a poor reputation. His mother is a virgin, but people believe that she's an adulteress. Immediately is set upon being persecuted. And then, of course, dies at a young age, being tortured to death. There's nothing appropriate about that treatment of God whatsoever. And yet he does that. And the reason he does all of this in this way is for two things. One, so that you can have hope. He loves you that much. And two, to get a message to you. I'm telling you. And by the way, don't just take my word for it. When we're going through this study, look it up for yourself so that you know this is really what Jesus taught. I am telling you, there has never been a message that has been so extremely twisted by so many people. I can just about guarantee you that you were taught lies about what Jesus taught. And we shouldn't be surprised. Jesus warned us about that. Do yourself a favor. Look to the teachings of Jesus with an open heart and an open mind. Forget the things that you were taught before and look only to what Jesus said and see if it matches. Now, just a little bit more housekeeping and we'll be done with the introduction and we'll get into our first part next week, Lord willing. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to not really be talking about the Gospel of John. We're going to be talking about the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The reason for this being is John is sort of the odd one out. In fact, about a year ago, I did a study of the book of John here at Purcellville, and often the things I'm studying with you all here are the same things I'm studying on Wednesday nights over here, so I don't really like those to overlap. So we're probably not going to be getting to the book of John for a long while, probably. Although, of course, it's a very good study. But the reason why we separate it Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John is because of the subject matter of both of those sections. Those four books are what we call the Gospels, and they are the four accounts in the Bible of the life of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels. The reason they're called the Synoptic Gospels, you break the word apart, S-Y-N, syn, as in synchronate, and then optic, as in optics, I can see. The word means seen together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke look at the life of Christ pretty much from the same perspective. John is known as the autoptic gospel. Auto, as in self, right? If something's automatic, it does it on its own. So the autoptic gospel. And John looks at the life of Christ from a completely different perspective. Now, there are many ways in which all four of them come from different perspectives, right? They all are looking towards different audiences, for example. They have different purposes in their writings, and different styles as well. But the events that are mentioned about the life of Christ, many of the exact same ones pop up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that do not pop up in John, and vice versa. So that's why we separate the two of them. I mentioned that this one is God was here, and it's sort of ironic we're not studying John because one of the major themes in the book of John is proving that Jesus was really God, or more accurately, is really God. The very first chapter of the book of John is sort of this essay about why Jesus is God, and then the idea keeps popping up over and over again. So the divinity of Christ is very much emphasized in the book of John. John also looks at it from a much more personal perspective. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's sort of from a more historical perspective, even though it's very personal to them. They tend to take it more professionally, I guess would be the best way to phrase it, whereas John is much more personal in his approach to the life of Christ. So we're not really focused that much on John. We're looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are some who believe that Mark is the first of these and that the other two were copied or sort of stolen from him. I don't think that's necessarily the most accurate way to represent it. First of all, I don't think we really have a way to know which one shows up first. That being said, I think it is very likely that either Matthew or Mark, I'll explain in a moment why I don't think it was Luke, but it's possible, very possible, that Matthew or Mark came first and that the other two were highly influenced by that book, particularly in its structures. Now, of course, we're coming at this study from a view that the Bible is the inspired word of God. And this seems strange considering that view. Why do you need to look at somebody else's work if this is coming from God? But we have to understand that often when we talk about inspiration, we use shorthand to quickly explain it. You might hear somebody say that the writers of the Bible kind of acted as secretaries for God. And I've done that myself. That's just a short way to quickly explain it, but it is an oversimplification. Um, the truth is, the process of inspiration, there's a lot of human involvement in it. And I think if you look from book to book, the amount of human involvement can change. I think if you look at a book like Psalms, for example, I think that one's highly human in its origin. Still divine because God is watching over it and making sure that what is being said is in line with his nature. But nevertheless, it is. I think you see a lot of King David and him personally within the book of Psalms. There are other places where I think you see very little human interaction with it, right? When you go to a book such as Leviticus, for example, I think the writing style of Moses would be the only thing that really pops up as his personal influence in it. This also, you also might have heard somebody make the claim that before the men of the church, they got their information from inspiration, whereas we get it from perspiration, which is a cute little phrase. And once again, I'm not condemning that because that's accurate, but it is a little bit of an oversimplification because we can't eliminate the idea that somebody at some point might have gotten it from both perspiration and inspiration, meaning God says you do the work as if you were going to do this yourself. And then I'm going to, when it actually comes down to writing it, I'm going to help you out. The reason I say that is you look over at the book of Luke. By the way, this is also why I don't think Luke was the first of these ones to be written. But you look over at Luke and look what it says at the very beginning, verse 1. Inasmuch as I have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word has delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. The book of Luke is written to one particular person. Maybe it's written to a guy named Theophilus, but that might be a nickname for somebody else, or it might be because the name means lover of God. It might be a code for any Christian. It's hard to tell. But look what he says at the beginning. I've compiled all of this. I did some work. I talked to some people. Luke was almost certainly not an eyewitness to most of the life of Christ. And he says, I did the work for this. I don't think this should bother us. It doesn't actually hurt the idea of inspiration. Just because Luke did a little work doesn't mean it's not inspired. And I think it's entirely possible that he looked at a book like Matthew or a book like Mark and said, yeah, that's a pretty good outline of it. The things of here are good. I'm going to put in a few details that they might not have included because I'm going towards a different audience, or this is coming from my perspective. But God wanted them to do that. There's a reason. There are 4 separate accounts. You know, there's no other life in the Bible of which there are 4 separate accounts. When you get into the Old Testament, there are a couple of lives that might have 2, because the books of Kings and the Chronicles, for example, they often overlap. But not like this. This happens 4 times, and I think it's there to show the importance of it, and so we can see this from multiple perspectives. The writers of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were, of course, written by Matthew, John, Mark, and Luke. Matthew was one of the apostles. He starts off life as a tax collector, and I believe of these 3 was the closest to Jesus. Now, I think the apostle John, who wrote the book of John, was closer to Jesus than Matthew was, but Matthew was still pretty close. Matthew writes his gospel mainly to a Jewish audience, and as a result, he tends to emphasize things that are important to the Jews. And it's often a favorite gospel of people today because Mark was written, it's thought, to the Romans, and Luke is kind of pointed towards Greeks. But a lot of cultural touchstones for the Romans and the Greeks, they're not here anymore. But we do have some of the ideas of the things the Jews knew. If you know your Old Testament anyway, the phrase "it is written" happens a lot in the book of Matthew, and it's making reference back to the Old Testament because he knows his audience knows the Old Testament. And so often Matthew means a lot to us. Mark is the shortest of this. Often, every once in a while, I'll have somebody ask, I really want to get into studying the Bible. Which book should I start with? I tell them the book of Mark. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, it's the story of Jesus, super important. Two, it's the shortest of the Gospels. And three, it also has some of the most succinct conclusions of the studies within that book, and some of the things you really need to know about the message of Jesus show up from Mark. And so Mark is great for that as well. Luke is the longest of the Gospels, and once again, it includes the same basic outline as Matthew and Mark, but it has a whole lot of details. Luke was a physician by his trade, and so he was very detail oriented. And it also is sort of an incomplete story because really the Gospel of Luke and then later the book of Acts, really it's kind of meant to be read as one big thing. Acts is the direct sequel to Luke. And it really picks up right where Luke left off, which also is a decent indicator that Luke is a little bit of a later gospel as well. But we'll get into that. We'll get into the descriptions of all three of those. And unlike our previous study where we were going chapter by chapter, it's not going to go perfectly like that. So I'm going to write out my own outline of this. I'll let you know where we are as we're going through it. But here's the big thing I want you to get from this. If nothing else, the big emphasis is look for yourself. Jesus is the most misrepresented character in all of history. Help yourself by looking through the lies and look to the Word only. Thank you so much for your attention. I love you all, and I hope to see you next week.